So Jasmine calls this sweet heart attack. And there's no question that people with diabetes have much greater vascular issues than people without diabetes. Glucose, we talked about this when we reviewed the labs last week, that insulin keeps glucose in a narrow range. That's its job, because when glucose leaves that narrow range, it can either be inflammatory on one end or insufficient in terms of providing fuel on the other end. So that just tells you that, outside of this range on the high end, there's something toxic about it. You could say it's toxic on both ends, but probably for different reasons. And I'd say the number one thing that we see is vascular disease. And diabetic neuropathy is a vascular condition. You have low blood flow to that tissue, which then leads to the neurological tissue starting to die. So anyway, this gets a little repetitive, but this is what we've got. The glycemic index. Michael, I'll let you just explain the glycemic index.
Oh, so, the glycemic index of foods is related to how they disturb your insulin levels and glucose levels. So you really want to consume low glycemic index foods to, keep the insulin levels more stable. You don't want, huge spikes and so forth. And ultimately that keeps your glucose levels a bit more stable.
Now, if you don't have this and you want it, this is our own glycemic index document that explains from this talk. But basically, we color code rather than worrying about numbers. We've gone through the different charts and came up with the numbers. And the glycemic index generally applies to carbohydrate-based foods. But we threw in, there's a fruit, beans, nuts, and seeds. Interesting here. I'll have to fix that. But looking at meats, Dr. Springer, this doctor that I worked with at one of our accounts in Indiana, says that even the traditionally raised meats have a glycemic index and have potentially, does corn have gluten, Michael?
Yeah, but it's different. So the gluten that people are more prone to would be the wheat, the barley, the rye. So the gliadin in that protein portion, but rice actually has gluten. So there are numbers of, vegetables and grains that actually have gluten, but they tend not to be as inflammatory as the gluten or the gliadin in wheat.
What he told me is that the regular beef, for someone who's very gluten sensitive, could trigger an allergic response. Anyway, that's so we cover a variety of different things and, kind of scale it for your sugars and your bars. There aren't that many healthy bars that have less than 5 grams of sugar per serving. So on and so forth. So that's our glycemic index. Very simple. Man, that's
my messages, because I never hear them. Sorry.
One of my clients, National Salvage, would appreciate that because they tear up railroad ties, so they want to know when the train's coming down the track. All it's simply saying here is that a high glycemic food pushes a lot of insulin and a lot of sugar, and then you tend to get a crash. Whereas low glycemic, we are a diesel engine. And a diesel engine, doesn't rev to 10,000 RPM. It kind of run in a steady state. And so do our bodies. When we exercise, we only increase our caloric consumption modestly. And when we sleep, we only decrease our caloric consumption modestly because our brain is still working, all the other aspects of our body, you know, the autonomic and what's the other word for it, but things that have to happen without our control are going on. But the point is, if we can feed our body to match our caloric demand, then we're going to be in much better balance. And
Tom, can I ask you a question and the doctor a question?
Yeah. Yes.
One is related to intermittent fasting, and the other is related to eating within a narrower framework versus the way we currently eat, which is probably 3+ meals a day.
So, I mean, intermittent fasting is a way to stabilize your insulin level. So anytime you put food in your mouth, whatever the case may be, you know, there's going to be a corresponding increase in glucose and insulin levels. So you're giving your body that downtime to recalibrate, so to speak. So I do intermittent fasting all the time, pretty much, almost every day, you know. But it's very, very beneficial to the body to generate, you know, autophagy, which is killing off of, you know, bad cells in the body and so forth. Obviously going the extreme levels where you're doing fasting for a day or 2 days or 3 days or longer, you know, enhances autophagy even more so. But where, you know, is concerned with here with the glycemic index and so forth, and how your insulin and glucose levels are running, intermittent fasting is very, very beneficial to the body.
The way I do intermittent fasting, Richard, is if you're insulin sensitive, then it plays less of a role. I usually use it as a tool for making you more insulin sensitive. But I think,
absolutely,
you know, there's a gentleman out there that has some amazing talks, and I think I mentioned it before. The title of his YouTube channel is What I've Learned. And he talks a lot about glucose and insulin and eating. And based on his research, he's a lay person, but you know, you can be Abe Lincoln and be one of the most intelligent people in health in the world if you study and you know what you're studying. But he has based on that video and others, he's decided that you know, 1 meal a day is right for him, and generally thinks it's right. I mean, you know, we're doing all these things because we've messed ourselves up. So like this cycle here is a perfectly acceptable cycle depending on what the time domain here is on the bottom. If the time domain is hours, then you're going to become a diabetic. If the time domain here is months, then you're just going through normal cycles that we had in the agrarian society, where when there's an abundance, you eat and you store for later. And when there's a lack of abundance, you famine, and your body is adapted to that and can burn fat as a fuel. So I think this curve is really, you know, telling, but more important than the y-axis is the x-axis. That's my scientific take. We talked about this marker last week, and you know, just basic measurements. I think it's just a sort of a bit of a reminder. A1C is just glycolated or caramelized red blood cells. And so what's the relationship between A1C and your poop? My favorite topic. It's because the poop is brown, it's red blood cells. Red blood cells only hang around for 4 months, 4 to 6 months, right? So this caramelized red blood cell is going to hang around for 4 to 6 months, and then it's gone. So now there's a normal red blood cell, and if you're still doing this stuff, and this is daily, you're going to caramelize that red blood cell again. But you have every opportunity to lower your A1C significantly by changing how much sugar you have in your bloodstream, and your A1C will go down. The problem is it's a trailing indicator because it's lagging behind by 4 to 6 months. So if you ever get doctor advice based on A1C, say, can you give me something more relevant? Give me something up to date, like fasting insulin, for example. So, Rosemary, I apologize. I have to fix my system so you can just come in, but triglycerides. Dr. Carter, I'll defer to you on triglycerides.
Oh, no, you can go ahead. Well, the triglycerides being the fatty acids and so forth, you know, people may tend to think that if they're eating a high fat diet, that may increase their triglycerides. Generally not. It's the overabundance of the carbohydrates that people are consuming, and that leads to, you know, the insulin resistance and then the buildup of fatty acids. One of the more important things that people really need to, you know, be cognizant of is that fatty liver is on a meteoric rise in individuals. And it's because of, you know, the overabundance of carbohydrates, also high fructose corn syrup, which is pretty much in every packaged food. And that is leading to liver dysfunction. So all of those things really need to be moderated. You know, obviously, no one should be consuming packaged foods because they're just bad, just in general. But yeah, go ahead.
To your point, Dr. Carter, I just pulled up a screen from Livestrong. Can losing weight raise your cholesterol temporarily? Now, this is a classic example of understanding how our body works from glycemic control and, you know, from processing fats. So first of all, so many misnomers. Your cholesterol doesn't go up. Your LDL goes up. And somehow we lived in this world where LDL is part of, and HDL is part of a cholesterol calculation, but it's not. It's just a soap. So why would losing weight raise your cholesterol, okay, raise your LDL temporarily? Anybody want to chime in?
Because your fat stores a lot of garbage and you need more LDL to clean it up when you're burning fat?
It's close. Well, when you burn fat.
Yeah.
How do we transport fats through our body? In LDL. In LDL. So when you reverse the storage process, you're depolymerizing, if you will, these complex fatty acids in the triglycerides. And it's the triglycerides that's somewhat fat soluble that gets carried to the tissue to be burned. You cannot lose weight if you don't burn fat. Okay? You cannot lose weight if you don't burn fat. So the more, like in the intermittent fasting, where you're really just creating insulin sensitivity by improving your body's efficiency at burning fat. I mean, fat is probably a slightly harder fuel to burn, so it's, you know, water flows downhill, so it's easier to burn the glucose. You have to train the body a little bit, and intermittent fasting does that, to burn the fat. But when you do that, your LDL will go up. And if you go to a traditional doctor, look, when I do labs on people, 90% have an LDL or total cholesterol number that would trigger a traditional doctor to put you on a statin drug. But if you're losing weight and you're intermittent fasting and things like that, you may well have an elevated LDL just because you need those transport taxis to carry that triglyceride or other consumable fat products from the liver, taking the fatty acid and converting them to a fuel, and they have to get around your bloodstream. So it's the craziest thing. That's why an LDL of 120, 140, probably a very very, very healthy thing. And then you know you're sufficient when your HDL goes up. It's a little simplification, but I think it's reasonably true. So it's like, the bottom line is, go ask your doctor why your LDL went up after you started losing weight. See if they know. Let's see. What's LDL? You mean your cholesterol? Okay, that was a smart aleck comment. Shame on me. But anyway, I brought that in because the triglycerides, you know, we're converting the fat to a fuel, and that's part of the process. So I don't exactly know where triglycerides come on the scale. You know, I know insulin goes up first, then the glucose, then the A1C, but triglycerides are somewhere along that range. So the chart again, this is our range of energy demands. Down here sleeping, up here vigorously exercising, and somewhere in the middle, just where we are right now. So the spikes are very deleterious because if this is the sugar, this is excess sugar that we don't need, but the insulin drives up afterwards, and I'll show you that chart in a minute, and then pushes your sugar down, and that's why you can go hypoglycemic with insulin. Okay, not a good thing. And then I referred, Dr. Carter already talked about the fatty liver caused by excess sugar. So just pay attention to your liver enzymes, and usually the standard of care measurement for the enzymes are probably twice what they should be. So your AST, ALT should be 20 or below. Is that about right, Dr. Carter?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So same chart reinforcing, your sugar levels go up, your insulin follows after that. Normal blood sugar really tied to normal energy needs. And then this creates a vicious cycle of hunger. One of these days, I promise this many times, we'll talk about the 26 things that make you and keep you hungry. So it's not just the calories. You may need to elevate your sugar based on your diet because you're nutrient deficient. And your brain is going to overpower any other urge you have to bring in fuel. So we have to think about separating fuel and nutrients in food. And we do that, it becomes a lot easier to satiate ourselves. We all saw this slide last week. Basically, there's the insulin. It pushes the sugar into the cell. If the cells had too much, it starts building resistance or it gets overloaded, so there's no place for the glucose to go. So it stays in circulation, but insulin is still out there, placing it someplace else because its job is to get the glucose down. So bacteria, viruses, fat, whatever it may be. So here's sort of a view, and Jason Fung is a little bit, different on interpreting this. What this basically says is that every cell has insulin receptors, but when you challenge these receptors with more fuel, the glucose, than the cell needs for metabolism, then you start shutting down some of these receptors. Dr. Carter, any opinion on which mechanism is more accurately describing insulin resistance?
No, I mean, that's all right. I mean, again, having the overabundance, of the glucose, which is basically just overloading the system, and just kind of think about the organs, turning off their, ears. It's like, I can't hear the signal anymore. You just put too much, glucose in the body, and the toxicity has overwhelmed me. So I'm just going to shut off and not allow it to pass in.
Right. We saw this. Diabetics have more infectious disease. Diabetics have more cancer, all that good stuff. And here's, the final, just showing the high glycemic medium glycemic, medium high glycemic. Oh, you have it high both times, and low glycemic. But you can see when you go low glycemic, the food is meeting your energy needs. So there's no reason why you couldn't do in a regime like this more than one meal per day. It's really about sustainability. I think the more keto adaptive you are, the more likely you are to stay in this domain all day long. Whereas if you're not completely keto adapted, then you take in fuel low on the glycemic index, but you still may see a decrease in overall blood glucose in that circumstance. So I think, the way you get keto adapted is eat one meal a day, but it may be uncomfortable for some at the beginning. You may experience some hypoglycemia. That's why you can graduate from 2 meals a day to 1 meal a day, or your intermittent fast being 10 hours, 12 hours, 14 hours, 16 hours, something like that, which will gradually bring you into an adaptation. I know when my wife first went major intermittent fasting, I mean, she just decided to fight through it, but she had all the hypoglycemic symptoms. I never experienced that because I like nibbling too much, but that's another issue. But just as, your brain needs 10 times more energy than regular cells. And one of the things your brain needs is healthy fats. So if you're not bringing in fats, you're going to eventually have a problem. Now vegans generally go low fat, and they have the discipline to go that diet. But I think long term, you've got to bring in fats. I said last time, I think Joel Fuhrman, like the uber vegan, there's no question that his advice is good for veganism. And I think it's healthy to go from a SAD diet, standard American diet, to a vegan diet for a while, just like ketogenic diet. But I know that dude is getting healthy fats from a variety of sources. And I don't often hear him really emphasizing that. So you've got to get, if you're vegan, you've got to get the fats from algae oil or other types of oils that, if you're going to avoid the marine oils, you've got to really up your oils, particularly the linoleic acids that convert to the omega-3s. So the walnut oil and the hemp oil and things like that. So I think everybody here understands what we're looking for, and it's just nutrient density. So the green vegetables, a lot of B, C, and K, the blueberries and the low glycemic fruits. There's a big difference in glycemic index going across the fruits. So the blueberries and strawberries are pretty low. Nuts and seeds, very dense in minerals. Citrus, particularly grapefruit, low in the glycemic index. Lemons, limes, very good at vitamin C. Peppers, very high in vitamin C. The garlic, the fatty fish. I need to get some mussels and things like that. Shrimp, very high in cholesterol. I just had a consult with a lady, her cholesterol is 154. We need to get that up higher. Shrimp is an excellent food for that. Eggs, very high in cholesterol, very high in sulfur, very underappreciated. And we will do a talk on sulfur at some point. But those of us who really have a hard time getting off of sugar, it's no surprise, because it's actually it's more addictive. Sugar is more addictive than cocaine in many aspects. So it's not an easy trick. But so next week, or in 2 weeks, I'm going to talk about many different strategies to acclimatize your palate to lower glycemic or no glycemic foods, because it's not just about taste. There are a number of factors, and I won't go into those now. Let's see what we have. So all the different things, Alzheimer's is type 3 diabetes, type 2 diabetes. When the brain's inflamed, the brain is so vascular that's going to be a problem. A lot of these foods do not support good gut flora, things of that nature. So it's a big issue. Sugar's a big issue. Here's an example of our chart. What do we have here? Simple things, eat food low on the glycemic index. And what I recommend our participants do is print out that color chart and put it on the refrigerator. Take it with them, grocery store. If you didn't hear the conference this weekend, the Natural Health Expo, Ty Bollinger said that an average American eats a half a pound of sugar a day, processed sugar, a half a pound. And if this group is eating no processed sugar, that means the average American is eating 3/4 of a pound to 1 pound of sugar a day. Because that's the average. That includes us. Okay, I'm helping the average, but the rest of you are pulling it down a little bit. Eat more healthy fats. They fuel the brain. Focus on nutrient density. So, all the things I think this group knows very well. Now, for some reason, Jasmine changed this slide, and I was too lazy to fix it. But Ty Bollinger knows me by a nickname. Michael, do you know what his nickname for me is?
No.
The Fathead. Because when I had lunch with him 2 years ago, I said, I'm proud to be called the Fathead. Okay? And everybody should strive to make their brain fattier than it is today. And that means your growing brain. So not a bad concept. So that used to be, be proud to call yourself a fathead, but that got sanitized. So anyway, I know this was sort of a basic topic and we didn't give you a whole lot of advice, but really, if you don't have it in your documents already and would like it, just send me a note. And this makes it very simple to see what you want to choose. And like I said, in 2 weeks, I'm going to get much more organic on what your plate could look like. Okay, what your plate could look like, particularly if you're trying to become more insulin sensitive. But I think in general, I call insulin resistance malnutrition, because that's really what it is. Over calorification, if that's a word, excess calories, and a lack of nutrients. And that's a vicious cycle. That's a vicious cycle. So elevated insulin is actually a sign of malnutrition. So we're going to talk about the best ways to be completely satiated in terms of nutrient concentration in your body. Anybody have any questions?
All
Thank you,
potatoes.
Amy. Thank you, Amy. I thought this was too simplified for questions. Go ahead, fire away.
I do talk too much, so if you can always just
No.
say. But on the potato thing, because there's so many different varieties of potatoes, so you can have a purple potato or a yellow. The red skin ones tend to be lower on the glycemic, I think. I mean, is every potato bad? Sweet potatoes are sweet. So I know do you demonize all potatoes or do you accept some?
No, it's not that they should be. I mean, all potatoes are fine. It just depends, again, where you are on the continuum. The white starchy potatoes will tend to be more on the glycemic index and so forth. But, everything really in moderation, and just kind of course, know where your insulin level is and do your glucose levels with the glucometer and find out how, your glucose numbers rise and fall based on what you're consuming. Yes, in general, the starchy, the white potatoes will tend to, disturb the insulin level more. But again, everybody's still a bit different on that continuum, and better to eat a white potato than, a box of mac and cheese.
Right.
So Amy, Dr. Carter and I know a gentleman who's head of this Fit Eyes program, and he and I are we don't quite see eye to eye. But anyway, he put his mother on a potato-only diet, and she went out of diabetes.
Yeah.
Wow.
And
Well, and the
that's-
Gerson uses potatoes. You eat as many as you can. There is a lot of nutrients, but
There's a lot of nutrients. Now, what happens when you're eating potatoes is pretty soon you're getting sick of eating potatoes, so the quantity of food you're eating goes down. You're getting lots of nutrients, and they're still going to be harder to process, most likely, than the processed food, and be less inflammatory.
Absolutely.
So I think ultimately you can put potatoes in your diet. I mean, I eat potatoes, when I'm tempted to have bread or rice or some other grain, and you're insulin sensitive, I think potatoes an excellent option. I've actually grown potatoes. They're much lower in the glycemic index. Okay. Growing, it's a bit of a misnomer. What I do is I take the potato and I slather it with a grass-fed butter. And now the effective glycemic index for that potato is much lower, isn't it, Michael?
I do too, Dr. Carter. I eat a lot of butter.
Yeah.
Grass-fed butter.
Yeah, yeah.
And I get raw when I can't.
The Kerrygold.
Yeah, the
I get it from an
Kerrygold, or I
Amish farm.
put coconut oil on it, and I put our salt mixture. And the effective glycemic index of that, you got to look at the plate. What is the plate now? The plate is, digestible carbohydrates and fat. So you've got to. It's not a bad plate when you look at it that way. And this morning I had for breakfast I had butternut squash with lots of butter and a little of my salt mixture, the sea salt with some potassium, and that was breakfast.
Again, the caveat to that, if you are ApoE44, that may be problematic consuming quote unquote high levels of good fats, because the ApoE44, there is a defect in the transport mechanism with your LDL, and you will tend to have higher particle number, more particles, tend more toward the oxidized LDL, which will make the cholesterol more atherogenic. So,
Dr. Carter, is that true? Are African Americans more likely to have the double 4 because of the fact that it has some sort of effect against malaria or something?
Yeah, I mean, in Africa it is, higher, degree of 4-4. I'm 3-3. So that's like the average risk of getting Alzheimer's and so forth. And I can eat a very high fat diet and my total cholesterol stays at like 180, but again, everyone's individual. So those are important to delve into.
Tom, for some reason I lost the picture, but I do have a question. Am I still online?
I hear you.
Okay, what's the age factor in this continuum that you talk about as we age in regards to all of this?
A big fat 0.
Big fat 0? You mean even though you can be in your 60s and 70s and 80s, it has no effect whatsoever?
I think it's a big fat 0. I mean, we get told, the more we get told to change our behaviors as we age, I think the faster we age. You gotta exercise as vigorously when you're 80 as you did when you were 20. Now the difference is if you didn't comport yourself well, I think it's not your age, Dr. Loudon, it's your physiological health. So if your SED rate's high, your C-reactive protein's high, your RDW is high, your vessels are weak, fibrinogen's high, cholesterol's low, all those things, then you're at risk, and you've been at risk a lot longer as you age. But if your physiology is healthy, don't factor age into those kinds of decisions.
Yeah, I agree with it.
Yeah,
that's a good note.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, Joanne.
Yeah. What do you think the average American consumes in net carbs per day, and what should it be?
I'm waiting for Dr. Carter. I don't know what the net carbs would be.
So ideally, I mean, it depends on what diet strategy you're trying to go after. If you're, doing a low carb, ketogenic, and the caveat to ketogenic is really 3 to 6 months of a ketogenic diet is kind of the limit that the vast majority of people should be on. You know, I've had patients who've done ketogenic diets and they've been on it for a year or 2 years, and that actually ultimately can cause insulin resistance. So it kind of all goes back to, you know, everything in moderation. So, yeah. So I've lost my train of thought.
No, but what number? And I'm thinking.
Oh yeah, the number. Yeah.
Oh, 100. So
the total carbs, based on the ketogenic diet, should be ideally less than 50. For most people, you know, if you're trying to, you know, keep your weight down and so forth, less than 100 grams of carbs. But, you know, on the opposite end of that, let's say, you know, you exercise quite a bit, because like I do P90X. So, and even though I'm intermittent fasting, I'm generally consuming 300, 400 grams of carbs a day, based on, because I juice a lot. You know, I have smoothies. I'm probably over 400 grams. But again, it just kind of depends on what your goal is. And again, it's still individualistic and what your body can handle. You know, I can handle a lot of carbs at this point now, especially since I intermittent fast. But if you're eating that amount of carbs, 200, 300, 400 grams throughout the course of the day, chances are your insulin levels are going to be high and your glucose and hemoglobin A1C are not going to be optimal.
One other thing on that, and that's what we're going to talk about in 2 weeks, is differentiating between digestible and non-digestible carbs. So, you know, the glycemic index is sort of a barometer for digestible versus non-digestible. So it's very hard to find data that calls out what the digestible amount is. So you really, when you're adding what your carbs are, you can take in 200, a plate I'm going to show you can look like 200 grams of carbs, but actually only be like 75. So in terms of crossing your intestine. So that's something as well. But that's why the glycemic index allows you to get where you want to be. For example, you can eat all you want of things that are low glycemic. Why? Because you're not really absorbing a lot of carbs in that instance. So that's never differentiated, or maybe it is differentiated, but we're not paying enough attention to it. But I went and looked at my deck I produced a year ago, and I have tons of charts on various groups trying to figure out what the digestible versus undigestible amounts are in all these foods. So like Dr. Carter, I know because we had to hire a pickup truck to pick up his celery when we went to that. And I would argue that celery has very low digestible.
Yeah, there's nothing. Yeah.
Very low digestible carbs. So if he's taking in 100 grams of carbs from that, you can subtract almost all of those. You know, they're really not getting into really not affecting his insulin.
Okay. No, thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else looking for a long answer to a short question?
This is Sonia. I was just thinking of Amy's question, and I found that when I first started learning that I needed to watch my glycemic, intake, and watch the glycemic index, what I used to do a lot is check using the glycometer all the time. So I try new food. So I've read, for example, that yellow Yukon potatoes are going to have lower glycemic index than white Idaho baking potatoes. So then you eat those, wait 2 hours, test yourself and see how your body reacts to it. And that way you could kind of create whatever is specific to you. Because I used to find sometimes there would be a food that had a supposedly high glycemic index. One was raw carrots. And I thought, this is not fair. I really like to eat carrots. That was a good snack for me. So I ate a gigantic bowl of carrots to test and see what happens. And for me anyway, didn't make one single bit of increase.
Right.
So I was safe for that. I think very much it's the person himself. or so.
And I would say, Sonia, for you, you know, you're on the continuum. So, you know, if you slide on the insulin continuum, where you slide, it may change. This is not something you do once and say, this is me. Always tie that number back to your fasting insulin. So when you do it in the future, you can compare those two. And so if you see any variations, you'll have a pretty good clue as to why you might see those variations. Very nice, though. Thanks for chiming in. That's very valuable information. Yeah. Yeah, I think potatoes being a root crop, I mean, they're nothing against them. The enemy is insulin resistance, not potatoes.
Right.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? All righty. Thanks for participating. Next week, shockwave therapy. For those of you who are not acclimatized to it, believe me, you don't know what Dr. Carter knows about it. It's going to be very informative. And the week after that, we're going to do, you know, digestible versus undigestible carbohydrates and what a good plate could look like.